waking up one morning and discovering that the man who treated your chest pain, who read your scans, who looked you in the eyes and told you everything was going to be fine, was never a doctor at all. No medical school, no degree, no license, no training of any kind. Just a man with a borrowed name, a manufactured history, and an almost supernatural ability to make people believe whatever he needed them to believe. This is not a story from 100 years ago when record keeping was loose and verification was a letter sent across 3 counties on horseback. This happened in a modern hospital with digital systems, with HR departments, with credential checking protocols that existed precisely to prevent this. They didn't work. His name, the name the world came to know him by, was Dr. Richard Calloway. He worked at Whitmore General Hospital in rural Ohio for 11 years. He delivered over 200 babies. He diagnosed hundreds of patients. He performed surgical procedures. He attended funerals of patients he had treated and stood with their families and accepted their gratitude for everything he had done. He was not a doctor. His real name was Marcus Ellroy Webb. He had never completed a single year of medical school. And by the time anyone thought to look closely enough to find that out, the damage he had caused stretched across a decade of lives. Today, we're going to walk through all of it. How it started, how it lasted, how it ended, and most importantly, why this story is not as rare as you need it to be. Marcus Ellroy Webb was born in 1971 in Dayton, Ohio, the second of 3 sons of a mechanic and a school secretary. By every account, it was an unremarkable childhood, not abusive, not traumatic in any visible clinical sense, but defined by something quieter and in some ways more corrosive, a chronic, suffocating sense of smallness. His older brother Daniel was the athlete. His younger brother Paul was the charmer, the easy laugher, the one people naturally gravitated toward. Marcus was neither. He was the middle child in every dimension the phrase implies, neither here nor there, neither celebrated nor troubled, moving through his school years in a kind of social invisibility that he felt but could never name. What he had, and what nobody gave him credit for, was intelligence, not the kind that showed up neatly on tests, though he did well enough, the kind that watched, that catalogued, that filed away the behaviour of people around him with the quiet precision of an archivist. He noticed things. He remembered things. And from a very young age he was fascinated, almost obsessively, by people who commanded rooms simply by existing in them. Doctors were at the top of that list. His family's physician was a man named Dr. Harold Stinson, a large silver-haired man with enormous hands and a voice like a cello. When Dr. Stinson walked into a room, everything reorganized itself around him. Patients sat up straighter, nurses moved differently. His father, a man Marcus had never seen defer to anyone, became almost childlike in his presence, answering questions carefully, laughing too quickly at the doctor's sparse humour. Marcus watched all of this with the intensity of someone studying a language they desperately want to speak. He enrolled in a pre-med program at Ohio State in 1989. He lasted 18 months. The academics were manageable. It was not inability that ended his medical education. It was something harder to admit and harder to explain. In the structured environment of an actual medical program, surrounded by people who shared his ambition but possessed what he privately acknowledged as a genuine passion for the science of it, he felt fraudulent in a different way than he would later become. He felt like someone pretending to belong to a world that didn't want him. The irony of that feeling, given what came next, is not lost on anyone who has studied his case. He dropped out in the spring of 1991 and moved back to Dayton. He worked a series of administrative jobs: hospital billing clerk, insurance processor, medical records coordinator. Each one placed him at the edge of the medical world he had wanted to inhabit. Close enough to learn, close enough to observe, close enough to let the language of medicine become, over years of quiet study, genuinely fluent. He read, compulsively, systematically. Medical textbooks purchased from used bookstores, clinical journals, surgical procedure manuals, case studies. He did not do this with any declared intention. He did it the way some people do crosswords or learn languages, because the knowledge was there and his mind had room for it, and something about the accumulation of it made him feel, for the first time in his adult life, like someone. The first deception was small. In 1997, at a social gathering in Columbus, he introduced himself to a woman named Claire as a physician. He wasn't sure, in the moment, why he said it. It came out the way improvised lies sometimes do. Not planned, but landed so smoothly that retracting it felt more disruptive than continuing. She asked him where he practiced. He named a hospital across the city. She asked about his specialty. He said general internal medicine. She was impressed. She introduced him to her friends. They were impressed. He drove home that night in a state he would later describe, in a court-ordered psychological evaluation, as the closest thing to peace I had felt in years. He was 26 years old. He had been lying about being a doctor for 4 hours, and it had worked perfectly. Over the following 3 years, the lie grew in controlled, deliberate increments. He used it socially, consistently. He built a coherent false history: medical school at Case Western, residency at Cleveland Clinic, a brief period working abroad. He memorized the timeline. He could discuss cases, reference professors, recall the texture of residency with the kind of specific, exhausted detail that only rings true because it is so unglamorous. None of it was real. All of it was convincing. In 2001, he moved to Whitmore County, a rural area of Ohio, roughly 2 hours south of Columbus, where a regional hospital was struggling with a severe physician shortage. He had spent 6 months researching. He knew that rural hospitals frequently operated under staffing pressures that made rigorous credential verification secondary to operational necessity. He knew that a general practitioner walking through the door with a plausible resume and a confident manner would be received very differently in Whitmore than in any urban centre. He arrived with a fabricated curriculum vitae, 2 forged reference letters from real physicians whose names he had taken from published medical journals, and a fraudulent license number, a real number, belonging to a real doctor named Richard Calloway, who had retired from practice in 1998 and moved to Florida. Marcus had found the name in a state licensing database and chosen it precisely because the real Calloway was old, geographically distant, and unlikely to ever encounter anyone from Whitmore County. He walked into Whitmore General Hospital in September 2001. They hired him in 3 weeks. The first year was the most precarious. Not because he came close to being caught, but because he was aware every single day of the gap between what he knew and what a real physician would know. He compensated with a strategy that was, in retrospect, almost elegant in its simplicity. He referred aggressively. Any case that felt beyond the edges of his self-taught competency, he referred to a specialist. Any diagnostic situation where he was uncertain, he ordered additional tests and consultations, framing it to patients as thoroughness rather than hesitation. He was known in his first year at Whitmore as an unusually careful physician. Cautious, methodical, a little slow, some colleagues said, but thorough. Thorough was exactly what he needed them to say. As the months passed, something unexpected happened. He got better. Not at performing surgery, he avoided that whenever possible, citing a preference for non-invasive approaches that was unusual but not inexplicable. But at general medicine, at reading patients, at the differential diagnosis process, that essential medical skill of narrowing down possibilities through systematic questioning and observation, he developed, through sheer accumulated practice, a genuine competence. He had seen enough cases, read enough, observed enough, that for routine presentations, his clinical judgment was not, in any meaningful sense, inferior to that of a legitimately trained generalist. This is the detail that disturbs medical professionals most when they study his case. The idea that you can become functionally adequate at something as consequential as medicine through informal autodidactic study and 10,000 hours of supervised fraud is not a comfortable thing to sit with. It challenges assumptions about what formal training actually provides and doesn't provide. His colleagues liked him. This matters, and it's worth dwelling on. Dr. Patricia Nguyen, who worked alongside him for 7 years and would later testify at his trial, described him in her deposition as one of the most genuinely caring physicians I have ever worked with. She said patients trusted him immediately, that he had a way of making people feel heard, unhurried, present, attentive, that she had never seen matched. She said she learned things from watching him talk to patients. She said this in a courtroom, with full knowledge of what he had done, and she said it clearly, without apparent embarrassment, because it was true. He coached his daughter's soccer team. He volunteered at the county food bank twice a year. He was, by every measure available to the people around him, a good man. This is part of what makes the story so difficult to resolve into something clean and morally satisfying. Marcus Webb was not a monster in the way true crime audiences are often comfortable expecting. He was something more unsettling, a person who caused real harm while simultaneously, genuinely caring about the people he harmed. The first serious error came in 2005. Her name was Susan Hartley. She was 43 years old, a kindergarten teacher, mother of 2, the kind of person described at every subsequent proceeding as universally beloved, which in her case appeared to be simply accurate rather than the obligatory eulogy language it so often is. She came to Marcus in March of that year complaining of persistent fatigue, intermittent chest discomfort, and what she described as a feeling of heaviness that she had been attributing to stress. Her presentation was, he would later acknowledge, ambiguous. A legitimate physician, seeing the full picture, might have ordered a cardiac workup as a precaution. Marcus ordered blood work and attributed her symptoms to anxiety and early perimenopause. She came back in June. The fatigue was worse. He adjusted her thyroid medication. In September, she collapsed at work during recess supervision. The ambulance took her to Whitmore General. The cardiologist on call discovered a significant blockage in her left anterior descending artery. What physicians call, with grim economy, the widowmaker. She survived, barely, and with permanent cardiac damage that would affect her quality of life for the rest of her years. She would never return to full-time teaching. An internal review was conducted. Marcus's treatment decisions were examined. The conclusion was that the missed diagnosis, while regrettable, fell within a range that could be attributed to clinical ambiguity. No disciplinary action was taken. He was counselled informally about the importance of maintaining a lower threshold for cardiac workup in middle-aged female patients, a known area of systematic underdiagnosis, even among fully licensed physicians. He sat in that meeting and received the counsel and nodded and felt, he later said, something shift inside him that never shifted back. Not guilt, or not only guilt, something more specific, the knowledge that he had hurt someone. That his decision, made in good faith with the knowledge he had genuinely damaged a person's life. He went home that evening and sat in his car in the driveway for 90 minutes. And then he went inside and made dinner and helped his children with homework and did not tell anyone. Between 2005 and 2010, investigators would later identify 4 additional cases where his treatment decisions likely contributed to delayed diagnosis or suboptimal care. None of them resulted in death. All of them resulted in outcomes that were measurably worse than what adequate treatments might have produced. 2 patients were never informed of the connection between his decisions and their outcomes. One never knew he had been investigated. One died of unrelated causes in 2009 without ever knowing the full story of her care. The system, designed with many redundancies and safety mechanisms, caught none of it in real time. Life at Whitmore General continued. Marcus continued. He received a performance commendation in 2007 for patient satisfaction scores. He was asked in 2009 if he would consider taking on a mentorship role for medical students on rotation. He declined, citing workload, without elaborating that the reason was more fundamental, that he could not, in any meaningful sense, teach people medicine when his own foundation was built on sand. In 2010, a new hospital administrator arrived. Her name was Janet Kowalski. She would change everything, though not immediately and not easily, and not in the way anyone involved would have chosen. Janet Kowalski was 51 years old when she arrived at Whitmore General as the new director of hospital administration. She had spent her career in healthcare administration at larger institutions in Pittsburgh and Cincinnati, and she had come to Whitmore partly for a slower pace and partly because her mother lived 40 minutes away and was beginning to need more support. She was not, by temperament or intention, an investigator. She was a process person, a systems person, someone who found genuine satisfaction in the alignment of procedure with practice, in the knowledge that what a policy said was happening and what was actually happening were the same thing. In her first month, she conducted what she called a credentials audit, a routine review of physician documentation to ensure all files were complete and current. It was not targeted at anyone. It was the kind of thing she did wherever she worked, because it was good practice and because it gave her a baseline understanding of the institution she was now responsible for. Marcus Webb's file was the 17th she reviewed. The file was full, thick even. A decade of performance reviews, patient satisfaction scores, continuing education certificates. Everything a physician's file should contain, assembled with the care of someone who had spent 11 years ensuring that if anyone ever looked, the paper would hold. But Janet Kowalski had a habit, idiosyncratic, the kind of thing colleagues sometimes found excessive, of verifying license numbers directly against the state database rather than simply accepting the number on file. She did it for every physician whose file she reviewed. It took 30 seconds per file. She had never, in 22 years of doing it, found a discrepancy. The search returned a result for Richard Calloway, MD licensed in Ohio, currently listed as inactive. Last known address, Naples, Florida. Date of birth, March 14th, 1941. Marcus Webb was 40 years old in 2011. Richard Calloway was 70. Janet sat with this for a long moment. There were explanations. The database could be wrong. The file could contain a transcription error. People make administrative mistakes. She was not a person who leapt to dramatic conclusions from a single data point. She composed a standard credentials verification request and sent it to the email address on file for Dr. Calloway. He didn't respond for 4 days. When he did, the response was smooth. A technical issue with his licensure renewal, he said. A clerical error at the state level that he had been meaning to address. He attached a document that appeared to be a renewal confirmation. The document looked correct. The letterhead looked correct. The signature looked correct. Janet forwarded it to the state medical board for confirmation. She did not hear back for 2 weeks. During those 2 weeks, she said nothing to anyone at the hospital. She did not know yet what she had found. She knew only that something did not align, and that misalignment, in her experience, was always worth following to its source. The state medical board's response arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. They had no record of the renewal document she had forwarded. The document appeared to have been created using a template available online. The license number associated with Richard Calloway had been flagged in their records as associated with a retired physician who had not renewed his license since 1998. She read this email 3 times. Then she called the hospital's legal counsel, closed her office door, and said, "I think we have a problem." What followed was 12 days of controlled, agonizing internal investigation, conducted in strict secrecy, involving only the hospital's CEO, legal counsel, Janet, and eventually a contact at the Ohio Medical Board's Enforcement Division. During those 12 days, Marcus continued to see patients. He continued to write prescriptions. He continued to be, to all outward appearances, Dr. Richard Calloway. The investigators verified that the real Richard Calloway was alive and well in Naples, Florida, and had no knowledge that his identity was being used. They confirmed that the medical school transcripts in Marcus's file were fabricated. The registrar at Case Western had no record of any student by that name or the student ID number listed. They confirmed that neither of the 2 physicians listed as references had ever had a colleague named Richard Calloway matching his description. They found Marcus's real identity through a background check on his social security number, which matched a Marcus Ellroy Webb of Dayton, Ohio, who had a college transcript from Ohio State showing 18 months of pre-med coursework, dropped, academic standing good, no disciplinary record. He had been working as a physician for 11 years. The decision about how to approach the arrest was made carefully. There were active patients in his care. There were ongoing treatment plans. A sudden disappearance would cause harm of its own kind. Disruption of care, unanswered questions, fear. They decided to confront him on a Wednesday morning, before clinic hours, with 2 officers from the county sheriff's department present and a colleague prepared to immediately assume his caseload. Janet was not in the room for the confrontation. She was asked if she wanted to be. She said no. The officers and the hospital CEO met Marcus in the administrative corridor at 7:45 in the morning. He was carrying a travel mug and had, by all accounts, a pleasant expression on his face when he turned and saw them waiting. He did not run. He did not argue. He did not produce another document or offer another explanation. He looked at the CEO for a long moment, and then he looked at the floor, and then he said very quietly, "How long have you known?" He was handcuffed and walked out of the hospital he had worked in for 11 years without incident. Several nurses who witnessed it from a distance described the scene as surreal, not violent, not dramatic. Just a man walking out of a building with his hands behind his back on a quiet Wednesday morning, and the world continuing exactly as it had been. The trial of Marcus Ellroy Webb lasted 19 days. He was charged with identity fraud, practicing medicine without a license, obtaining employment by deception, and the charge that carried the most weight in both the legal and the human sense, criminal negligence causing bodily harm in connection with Susan Hartley's case and two others identified during the investigation. The prosecution's case was, in one sense, straightforward. The facts were not in dispute. Marcus had not fabricated an alibi or constructed competing evidence. He had simply, for 11 years, been someone he was not. The documentation was fraudulent. The license was stolen. The degree was non-existent. These were verifiable facts that no defense attorney could meaningfully contest. What the defense contested was the harm, and this was where the trial became genuinely complicated. The defense called 6 former patients as witnesses. All 6 testified voluntarily, without subpoena. All 6 said versions of the same thing: that Marcus Webb had been a good doctor, that he had listened, that he had helped them, that his care had been attentive and thoughtful, and in their experience, effective. One man, a farmer named Dale Hutchins, who had been Marcus's patient for 8 years, said that Marcus had been the first doctor who had ever explained to him what was happening in his own body in language he could actually understand, and that this had made him more engaged in his own healthcare than he had ever been. The prosecutor did not dispute any of this. She said, in her closing argument, that it was possible for a person to cause real harm and real good simultaneously, and that the legal system was not equipped to weigh one against the other, only to determine whether a law had been broken and whether that breaking had caused damage. Both, she said, were beyond question. Patricia Nguyen, the colleague who had worked beside Marcus for 7 years, testified for the prosecution. She said she felt betrayed. She said she felt ashamed, not of him, but of herself, for not seeing it. She said she had trained for years to develop clinical judgment, and that the knowledge that her judgment had been so completely misled by someone she trusted made her question, in ways she was still working through, what clinical judgment actually was. Susan Hartley testified on the 14th day. She was 50 years old by then. She walked slowly, with a visible effort that was not present in the photographs from her years as a teacher. She spoke about the morning she collapsed in the schoolyard, and the children who had stood in a circle around her, and the paramedic who had told her later that she had been minutes from death. She said she did not know, when she looked at Marcus across the courtroom, whether she felt angry. She said she had expected to feel angry and found that what she felt was more complicated than that, something closer to grief. Grief for the trust she had given, and the trust she would never be able to give in the same uncomplicated way again. She said, "I don't know if a real doctor would have caught it. Maybe they would have missed it too. Maybe this is one of those stories that doesn't have a clean ending where the right thing and the wrong thing are in separate boxes and you can close the lid on both. I just know that I walked into his office and I trusted him, and I deserved to be trusting someone who was actually there." The courtroom was quiet for a long time after she finished. Marcus Webb was sentenced to 7 years in federal prison on the primary fraud charges. The negligence charges resulted in an additional suspended sentence of 3 years and a permanent prohibition from any role in healthcare administration, credentialing, or patient care. He was ordered to pay restitution totaling $240,000, distributed among the patients identified as harmed. He made a statement before sentencing. He did not ask for sympathy. He said he understood finally that the harm of what he had done was not primarily in the decisions he had made, some of which were correct, some of which were not, but in the fundamental theft of consent. That every patient who had trusted him had trusted someone who did not exist. That the real damage was not always visible in a scan or a chart. It was in the violation of something that could not be restored. He said he was sorry. He said it plainly, without elaboration, and sat down. The investigation into Whitmore General's credentialing practices resulted in a separate regulatory action. The hospital was found to have multiple systemic failures in its verification processes. Failures that extended well beyond Marcus's case and reflected an institutional culture of procedural informality that had developed, as these things often do, gradually and without malicious intent. The hospital CEO resigned. The credentialing coordinator was terminated. A comprehensive audit of all physician files was conducted, resulting in the identification of 2 additional staff members with irregularities in their credentials, neither as serious as Marcus's, but both resulting in termination. None of this made the news outside Ohio. It was a local story of moderate scale. There was no Netflix documentary, no podcast. The world moved on, as it does. Susan Hartley used her restitution to pay down medical debt. She now volunteers with a patient advocacy organisation that helps people navigate complex medical situations. She has spoken in interviews about the experience of having your trust broken by someone in a position of medical authority. She does not speak about Marcus specifically. She speaks about systems, about what we assume is protecting us, and what we discover when things go wrong was never as solid as we needed it to be. Here is something the mainstream coverage of cases like this rarely lingers on long enough. Marcus Webb was not unique. He was not even particularly unusual. Medical imposture, the practice of impersonating a licensed physician, has been documented in virtually every country with a formal medical system. The United States alone has recorded over 200 confirmed cases in the past 40 years. The actual number is almost certainly higher, because the cases that are confirmed are, by definition, the ones that were caught. The ones that weren't are invisible by their very nature. Research into why these cases occur, and more critically, why they persist, identifies 3 recurring structural vulnerabilities. The first is credential verification. Medical licensing in the United States is managed at the state level, creating a patchwork of databases that do not automatically communicate with each other. A physician who loses their license in one state can, in principle, apply in another. A fraudulent credential that passes cursory inspection in a rural institution may never be subjected to the deeper verification that would expose it. The systems are better than they were 20 years ago. Online databases have replaced paper trail verification in most jurisdictions, but they require someone to use them consistently as routine practice rather than exceptional response. The second vulnerability is institutional pressure. Rural hospitals, community health centres, and understaffed urban practices frequently operate under conditions where a physician shortage is an acute, immediate, operationally threatening problem. When the alternative to accepting a plausible candidate quickly is leaving a position unfilled for months, the gravitational pull toward expedience is real and documentable. This is not a moral failing on the part of individual administrators. It is a structural consequence of broader failures in physician workforce distribution that no individual hospital can solve. The third vulnerability is perhaps the most intractable. It is human. It is the fact that trust in the medical encounter is not a bug in the system. It is the system. The therapeutic relationship depends on it. A patient who fully doubts their physician cannot be effectively treated. A physician who is constantly required to prove their legitimacy in real time cannot function. The entire structure of medical care is built on a foundation of presumed credibility. And that foundation, once it exists, is available to anyone willing to step onto it. The experts who study this, forensic psychologists, healthcare administrators, medical ethicists, tend to converge on the same uncomfortable conclusion. There is no version of a functional medical system that is completely immune to this kind of fraud. You can reduce the risk. You can build better verification systems. You can create cultures of institutional accountability. But you cannot design out the human need to trust. And wherever there is trust, there is the possibility that someone will find a way to exploit it. What you can do, what the literature consistently recommends, is make the cost of fraud visible. Make the systemic failures that enable it visible. Make the experience of the people who are harmed visible, rather than tidying it away into sealed court records and quiet restitution payments that allow institutions to move on without reckoning with what they permitted to happen. That is why stories like this one matter. Not as entertainment, though there is something in the human mind that reaches instinctively for narrative in moments of moral complexity, but as evidence of what systems assume, of what they fail to check, of what a determined person can build in the gap between assumption and verification. Marcus Ellroy Webb was released from federal custody in 2018 after serving 6 years. His current whereabouts are not publicly documented. He has given no interviews. Janet Kowalski, the administrator who found the thread and pulled it, was recognized by the Ohio Hospital Association for her work in patient safety. She still works in healthcare administration. She said, in a rare public comment made at a credentialing conference in 2019, that she thinks about the 17 files she reviewed before Marcus's, all the ones she checked and found in order, and wonders how many other institutions have a file 17th from the end that nobody has gotten around to looking at yet. She said she doesn't say this to frighten people. She says it because she believes that fear is not the right response to an institutional failure. Understanding is. And understanding requires looking at the thing clearly, without flinching away from how ordinary it was, how routine, how it happened not because of some spectacular breach, but because a form wasn't followed, a database wasn't checked, and a man walked through a door that nobody thought to lock. Susan Hartley, the last time she was interviewed, was asked if she had forgiven Marcus Webb. She thought about the question for a long time. Then she said, I don't think forgiveness is the right frame. I think the right frame is understanding what happened well enough that it doesn't happen to someone else, and then doing the work to make that true. Forgiveness is something I do for myself, in my own time, in my own way. It has nothing to do with him. She paused, and then she added, I just want someone to lock the door. If this story made you think about the systems we trust, about the spaces between assumption and verification, about what it means to hand your well-being to another person and what that person owes you in return, then share it. Not because sharing solves anything, but because the more clearly we see how these failures work, the harder it becomes for them to keep happening quietly. I'll see you in the next one.